Hello, and thank you for joining us this week. This is RightCast Radio. I am your host. They call me the Jackrabbit. With me, as always, is the creator and founder of rightchan.org,
Shadus,
and our two commentators,
Cobra,
and Pot. All right. Today we're here to discuss how to deal with our fringe element. We discuss a lot on this podcast how to deal with the left and how to respond to the left and with their psycho nonsense and the screaming and the screeching and the inability to hold a conversation, but we don't really talk about our fringe element. And when I mean our fringe element, I mean the true white supremacists, the aviators, the
neo-Nazis, Aryan Brotherhood.
The Aryan Brotherhood, and also the hardliners, the purity.
Purity spirals.
Yeah.
People who want to just kind of dissect the whole thing down to
Right.
oblivion.
And then the groups that refuse to allow any kind of wiggle room for their ideology. They have to have it exactly the way they've painted it out in their minds, and anything other than that will not do.
Right.
How do we, because I believe it's a large strain on the movement. It's hurtful to the cause in general, and how do we deal with them?
Well, to a certain degree, it's a little complicated in that when you talk about the right as a monolith, when you call the right as a whole a movement, that's not entirely accurate because the right is, by its very nature, many different movements. There are, we've got monarchists, we've got constitutionalists, we've got the, anarcho-capitalists, we've got all kinds of different things.
And we do have to admit, much as we'd hate to, that neoconservatives are kind of on the right, too.
No. Neoconservatives are, they're more classical liberals than anything else.
Well, and they're more center than anything.
They're not really right.
Economically, maybe.
And that's
but not socially, I wouldn't think.
I would contend that there's no such thing as an economic right. Mm-hmm. When you look at what the right is, where the term comes from is actually the aftermath of the French Revolution. And to be on the right was to support the monarchy, to support traditional ways of life,
right.
To support the old order. And back then, they didn't really have much of a concept of economics as it relates to politics. So that's kind of why I kind of exclude neoconservatives.
Yeah. Which is interesting. This is off topic, but it's interesting to note. You were talking about the French Revolution and the idea that the left views us as, and I feel like it's we can jump into this later, but I think it's interesting to note that I think the left sees the alt-right and the similar movements. I think they see us as some form of bourgeois types that were like Marie Antoinette, like one of the famous stories of Let Them Eat Cake. I feel like that's the way the left sees a lot of us. That we're not really that connected to what's going on, what reality is, or what the suffering of the proletariat, if you will. Which
and yet, whenever Antifa tries to mobilize in the streets and are beaten with batons by the police, the proletariat claps and cheers.
Yeah. Again, like I was saying, this is off topic completely, but I found it to be an interesting side note to drop in there. It's important to know how you are perceived, so you know how to move forward.
Right.
Anyway, getting back on topic.
But as far as fringe elements on the right, you're mostly looking honestly at people at groups like, for instance, the National Socialist Movement.
Mm-hmm.
And groups like that, I think, pose a real danger, because they are inherently fractious.
Uh-huh.
They want to split society along very hard lines. And I've expressed the sentiment before that I'm an ethno-nationalist, but I am also willing to set that aside for the greater good.
Mm-hmm.
I am willing to set that aside in the interest of maintaining law and order and making sure that certain abuses don't occur.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Another consideration to take into that, also as an ethno-nationalist, something I really have to think about, and something I spend a good deal of time thinking about, is how ethno is our ethno-nationalism. Murdoch does a series of funny, silly a little ridiculous cartoons on YouTube.
100% pure Bavarian phenotype.
His most recent one that I watched depicts the foundation of a quote-unquote white ethno-state in the Pacific Northwest. But two of the characters are excluded from the white ethno-state because they are Irish. And being Irish means they are not white enough to enter the white ethno-state.
Because they're not part of continental Europe.
Yeah, so, like, even us ethno-nationalists really have to think about, like, how far do we take purity spiraling? Because if we take it too far, are we any different from the fringe elements we're talking about?
Well, I think a good compromise is when you read the writings of Benito Mussolini. He brings up the concept of what he calls the race of spirit, and it's the idea that race specifically in a classical fascist context. Race is the people of a particular country, as united under the state, who share a common culture and who are united in a common purpose.
Right.
It's kind of like what I've always said with if you can follow our rules, you're more than welcome to stay, kind of thing. I think that's a reasonable compromise, at least on the race issue. Like we're all one people united in a common goal.
I toyed with this idea a little bit. So I'm going to jump over into the spiritual realm just to make a point, and then I'm going to come right back. I'm not derailing this into a spiritual conversation. However, I am involved in a group that is folkish heathen, which means that the idea is that a individual with African ancestry shouldn't be a heathen, because the ideas behind heathenry is worship of the gods and the revering of your ancestors. Mm-hmm. The mentality behind that is not, this is our club, go away. Yeah. The mentality of that is, why would you?
Yeah,
because
go find your own club.
No, it's not that. It's you would be inherently praying to strangers. Yeah. Our ancestors aren't your ancestors. Our gods are not your gods. You've never had any contact with these guys. It's befuddling. Why would you attempt to? The same reason that I couldn't go into a Native American tribal proceedings, because I'm not welcome there. Those aren't my people. I don't have any kind of background there, and it's not an attitude of hate. It's an attitude of, these aren't your folk. Yeah. But that being said, when you start playing the game of, well, what's a real folkish? What is a real person of the quote unquote the blood? And you start to worry about stuff like that and wonder, because you don't want to be. And I kind of came to this realization fairly recently, because I've been spending the last few weeks thinking about this, and I came to the idea that everybody identifies as something. Very few people I've met, when they identify themselves, do they identify themselves as I'm half this and half that. Yeah. Even if they are. Now they may say that in passing, but their actions and the way they act and stuff usually very clearly shows that they behave in accordance to one group or the other.
Yeah, case in point, I know, like with myself, I'm predominantly of German descent, and that's the descent that I guess claim to. Whenever someone asks me, who are your ancestors? On my mother's side, I'm also Irish, a little bit of Blackfoot Indian, a whole bunch of French back there somewhere. Essentially, I'm just the all-American mutt when you look at it. But like you were saying, I claim to one that predominant, what is my father's people, and that's...
Yeah, and ideally the idea there, for me anyway, is the blood calls. And that's what I tell people, like, when someone's born, and this is what I believe, and this is a little esoteric, and I understand that, but it's the only way it makes sense to me, is that the blood calls. Like, you have been claimed, or you have claimed a certain heritage, or a certain heritage have claimed you, depending on how you look at that. Yeah. This is the way you react, this is the way you view the world, therefore this is the way that you respond to things. Right. Now, that may not work with everybody, but for the most part it seems to have worked for a significant portion, and I think that I think that once you've made that decision, or an individual has demonstrated, hey, this is what I believe, or you see the way they act.
Yeah.
It is beyond that point that I find it to be hateful and not helpful in any way to be like, oh, but you're half such and such. You can't be.
Yeah.
Because, does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah. Run this by you, man, because, it's just kind of roping us back into the conversation.
Right.
Early, when there was in the earlier American times, when there was a heavy amount of European immigration,
mm-hmm.
was there still that, because you had people from various different European backgrounds that came to the U.S. kind of threw off within one or two generations their older ideologies and their older identities, and they became Americans. They still, in a way, held on to, I'm from the motherland, but, I'm an American now. Or, case in point, you have say you have Italian immigrants that fight for the American army in the Second World War,
mm-hmm.
Against their homeland. At that point, how do you contrast that today with the immigrants that you have, say, the South American South American immigrants and your Latinos and stuff, and then you have this far right movement that says, "Oh, we don't like you because you're brown or whatever."
Mm-hmm.
That's these groups that legitimately do exist. Most right wingers are not that bad, but you do have that fringe element there. Let's say you have a Mexican that comes in and say he's 2 generations in and he's very much Americanized. How do we handle that as, first of all, from our differing viewpoints, do we shut the fringe element, we tell them to shut up and stop, screaming and wailing, oh, you're predominantly Mexican, or,
Well, you can't shut that fringe element up. You have to... The trick isn't to shut them up. The trick is to delegitimize them.
Okay.
And in using what you were saying, the Americanization of an individual, what I was referring to was not nationality, I guess.
Yeah, it was more of a religious...
It was not just religious. It's also so let's use the Italian and the Latino that you were talking about.
Okay.
That Italian still has very strong Italian roots. His family's still from Sicily. He may speak Italian still. He still eats very traditional foods because that's what his grandma cooked.
Yeah.
The same thing with a Latino. The foods, the language, the culture. That's what I'm referring to when I say stuff like that.
Right.
When I say the blood calls, that's what I mean. What I mean is like
you do things the way your family does them,
which is an extension of the way your culture that your fathering or your fathering culture did.
Yeah, you're in this case speaking of nationality and ethnicity more in cultural terms than biological terms.
Correct. Well, because here's my problem with biological terms. After a certain point, that stops helping.
Yeah.
Because because of the way that people, this actually is getting into a piece I'm getting ready to write for the website. When you start there's been so much inbreeding within like cultures and people travel. We live in a global world, whether we like it or not. People travel, and love's a funny thing. People meet people from other parts of the world and they have babies. That happens.
Yeah.
That is, to me, is not a fucking problem. Now, there's some screeching far-right types that is a huge problem.
Yeah.
And the idea there is just because of that intermixing to a certain extent, we still have where we sit right now in the world. We still have very distinct ethnic lines, but they are much muddier than they used to be.
Oh Lord, yeah.
Actually, go ahead.
Well, and this is it's kind of interesting. I actually have a good deal of Sicilian in me, and that's on my mother's side. But my mother's side is probably... My mother is 3/4 English and 1/4 Sicilian. My father, however, is almost entirely Norse. We've seen the genetic testing.
Yeah.
But, so, I claim that as the majority of my blood and how I live my life, the way I express my culture, is that Norse culture. But at the same time, and, wow, rabbit hole. At the same time, though, where do we draw the line between, I identify as Norse, and I actually am Norse? Where do we draw the line?
And that's that falls back.
Identifying as something,
Right.
like the left is very fond of people identifying.
Yeah.
as
Well,
something.
here's where I was referring to the blood calls, and
Yeah.
when I'm saying that, like, we'll take we can take both Norse mythology and modern day Norse practitioners, Odinists and Asatruer, and you can also take Christianity, your definite your Catholicism and the Orthodox and these types.
Mm-hmm.
When I say the blood calls, what I mean by that is, especially like in stuff like heathenism and stuff like that, you can tell the difference between people who think it's cool
And people are
and people who are legitimately serious about it.
Yeah.
Because here's the trick with, and I didn't mean to turn this into the Asatru hour, but since we're here, the difference being is that nobody who actually practices Asatru today, Vikings were cool. Yeah, Vikings are awesome. Everybody likes Vikings. That's not what the religion is. The religion is a 40,000-year-old cultural, ethnic religion.
Yeah.
These people, 40,000 years back to Paleolithic times, were studying this stuff, and they passed these stories down, and the idea there is that it was a way of life. It's a religion based around a very strong idea behind family. Mm-hmm. It's a very strong basis on hospitality, mm-hmm. and it's a very strong basis in coming together and creating a group, clan, and being hospitable and being, so that's the difference. You can tell people that think it's cool and people that are actually legitimately interested in the background.
Yeah.
Okay, so this actually ties back into the actual discussion, delegitimizing, say, the Aryan Brotherhood.
Correct.
They claim white power, white power, white power because it's apparently cool to be white. I seem to think so anyway. And yet they come out of prison with full back tattoos. Their faces are covered up in sugar skulls. They comport themselves like Latinos. So you delegitimize their position by drawing the contrast between their claimed white identity and the fact that their culture is contrary to such.
And I would like to point out that in Southern California there is a neo-Nazi gang called the Nazi Lowriders. They are entirely Hispanic.
Well,
now that said, National Socialism.
It's not inherently a white belief system. It just happened to have been in a white country.
Yeah,
it happened in.
Yeah. On the and like on my side of things, politically at least, we're perfectly okay with people having, recognizing where they come from. Mm-hmm. But when you start talking about, for instance, the entire country or like administrative regions, things like that, mm-hmm. the nation comes first. The country comes first.
Mm-hmm. Well, the issue you run into with specifically America, the problem you run into that is it hasn't been around long enough for people to put any kind of roots down.
Yeah.
The oldest family that can be from here, or that is in America proper, we'll say that. I'm not talking about like Native Indians or the Vikings that came in and settled. I'm talking about came over Mayflower. That whole story. The longest you can have is what, like 600-700 years,
300 or so.
Okay,
my family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not a lot of time.
No, it's really,
and that's not enough to. That's not enough to create a cultural identity.
We do, however, here in the States have certain cultural things. For instance, American sports.
Yeah, baseball and apple pie. And all that.
Baseball and American football are uniquely American. That is unique American culture.
Oh, yeah, just look back in the 1950s.
There is
and 40s,
for hundreds of years up until the last 50 or 60 years, there was an American work ethic that was largely Anglo-Saxon in nature, but we used to take a lot of pride in things. There are certain cultural staples that are unique to Americans.
Right.
And when I talk about, American culture and the fascist idea of the race of the spirit, that's what we're talking about. Are those things that are unique to our national character.
And I get that. What I'm saying is, I understand what you're saying. You're not incorrect. Like, America has been around long enough to have an identity.
Yeah.
It has not been around long enough to create an identity, is what I'm saying. When and this is kind of murky waters because it's a very fine line. You can say I'm an American, and that entails a few things. Like that people generally have an idea of what your stereotypical stock American looks like.
Yeah, Midwest.
But then they might ask, where are your ancestors from?
Exactly.
There isn't an American ethnicity.
Exactly.
And that's where
we have not been around long enough to create an ethnicity.
Is it that? Because back in the day, I think the American race was a common thing a common term that people used to use. So
that's back when we were 80%, Western and Central European.
Right.
We were French, we were German, we were Scandinavian, we were English, Scottish.
Right.
We had a very definite Germano-Celtic culture, essentially. But a lot of that's been lost because we have this this unfettered, kind of unregulated mass immigration policy that is detrimental to national culture and national identity, because we have a lot of people who come in and go, well, for instance, you look at any mass demonstration by Hispanic Americans, for instance. Well, they're not
Hispanic or Latino. There is a difference. If you're talking about Mexicans and from Central America, that is Latino. There is do you know this difference? Do I know something you don't know?
I'm going by U.S. Census terms. The U.S. Census does not differentiate.
And they are stupid and wrong.
I don't care. They're all brown.
Actually, this is interesting. Do you honestly not know the difference?
I've never really cared.
Okay.
To be perfectly honest.
There is a pretty distinct difference. So the Latino is basically from Central America, and infers being from Latin America. There's a very strong mestizo mix in there, like the mestizo Indians. You have a lot of Incan culture in there. You have a lot of Maya, that kind of stuff. These very Indian and mixed with the Spaniards that came in so many years ago, and this is what's called Latino culture. Hispanic simply means they speak Spanish.
Yeah.
Spain is Hispanic because they speak Spanish.
Yeah.
Cuba is Hispanic because they speak Spanish. Cuba has 3 distinct ethnicities in it. It has an Asian population, it has a black population, and it has a white population. So Hispanic only means they speak Spanish. So being Hispanic does not mean you're not European. It simply means that you come from a Spanish-speaking country. Latino means that you are very, very much not European. It's an Indian and Latin American root. It's interesting. It means nothing, but it's an interesting differentiate. It's getting muddied a little bit, which is why I don't like that, because there is a difference, and I feel like these kind of things are important if you're going to have these kind of discussions. You need to know the difference.
I tend to use them interchangeably because the cultures like in the Spanish speaking areas of the Caribbean and from probably central Mexico southward, the cultures are all very similar. They have
at least from our outside perspective.
At least from our outside perspective, and I don't claim to be a culture expert in that part of the world because I just don't care. I don't find their culture interesting. But that's their culture. It's not really my place to critique it too much.
But anyway, back to the topic.
Yeah, back to the topic.
Mexican immigrants come here and wave the Mexican flag. They clearly have little to no interest in being American.
Right. I think
why are they here?
I think if you live here and you don't view yourself as American, we should just send you somewhere else.
Right, and this actually brings up an interesting point. How do we, because I do believe in a very controlled system of immigration. I was all on board for Trump's border wall, Sadly, that's all smoke and mirrors, it appears. But anyway.
He's basically a Democrat. Let's be real here.
Yeah. So, looking at that, how do we, because I do believe that people, if you've got someone who lives in, say, Cuba or Venezuela or something to that effect, and they look at the American dream, they look at American sense of freedom and our values and our ideals, and they say, I really want to do that. I really want to be a part of that and to go contribute. How do we allow that in instead of, because I don't think, because when you get into like the, things such as ethno-nationalism, it's a very fine line between that and full-blown racism.
Yeah.
So how do we allow people that want to be a part of us, that want to integrate in, and control our fringe element for saying, oh, no, you're brown, so you have to stay out?
Well, here's
I hate the brown people.
speaking from speaking from my perspective at least, and this is actually something that I recently joined a relatively new political party, and part of our party line is no immigration. of any kind.
Would you care to tell them what the political party is?
It's the American Black Shirts Party. We're a classical fascist party. We operate on the teachings of Benito Mussolini and several others afterwards.
Right.
But we do absolutely disavow racism.
Okay.
Because we believe that the citizenry of the country should be treated as a singular people under the state.
Right.
The reason I believe for a complete immigration shutdown
is so that we have enough time to form an American ethnicity.
Yeah, we can become a distinct people, essentially. Another reason, at least from my perspective, that I think a total immigration shutdown is if we allow people, the only people who really look at us and go, I want to be there so I can make something of myself.
Yeah.
Because let's be real, most immigrants come here to make a quick buck and send it back.
Yeah.
Like, let's be honest.
Yeah, I mean, that's...
The people who come here to genuinely better themselves are the best and brightest their countries have to offer. We rob those countries when we let those people come in.
Okay.
They could be in their home country, improving the standard of life for their own people.
Okay, but in the case of, say, Cuba, where they're regulating what you're allowed to buy every week because they're so hardcore Marxists, shouldn't we open doors there?
As far as the Cuban question goes, that was probably poor phrasing because I don't have any problem with Cuba, but let's be real, communism isn't going to last long in Cuba.
Right. I'm just talking about. Okay, let's say. Okay,
well, let's use a different country then.
Yeah, North Korea or China or
any country that's kind of oppressed like that. Let's be honest. What's better, letting their best and brightest come here while their own people starve and suffer under those regimes?
Right, but they're not going to be able to change anything from there. So,
that's what they said about our own revolution. That's what they've said about every revolution.
Yeah, but you're not
getting away with that.
You're talking about muskets versus number one. First of all, most Chinese do not own firearms. No. Cannot own firearms.
But there's 1.4 billion of them, and only a few thousand government officials.
Right, but once again, you look at the modern military, and a case in point, there was I think a couple of, and this is coming back. I had a old boss that someone that he knew fought in Korea, and back when mainland China had a bit of a skirmish between them and essentially something that happened along the border that pissed off the Chinese. So the Chinese actually came after them, and these American soldiers had machine guns, and they were pouring water on the machine gun to keep it cool, but they were still mowing these people down in droves. So once again, I reiterate my point, they're not going to be able to do anything in their own country. So why not?
Then again,
and if you're using the U.S. as your litmus test, I'm sorry, France won that war for us.
Yeah,
I'm not using the U.S. as a litmus test.
All right,
the USSR fell apart from within, and China will too.
Right, but it fell apart organically, and they're not exactly much freer today than they were.
Actually, if you look at the reality of it, I'm not going to let you get away with that.
Okay, all right.
If you look at the reality of it, the average Russian is so much better off now than they used to be.
Okay, all right.
Infinitely better.
Okay.
Yeah, Russia's corrupt. We'll be honest about it. But the average Russian has a higher median income. They have access to better health care. They're not waiting in line for decades to try and get a simple surgery.
Right.
They're not getting thrown into gulags for religion at all in general.
Like, if you want to bring up that Russia's objectively better off now.
Okay, but you understand the main point of my argument though, because let's rewind it back to 1930s, 1940s when the USSR was still in its height.
Well, they were objectively better off then than they were under the Tsar.
Right, but you understand the point I'm trying to make here is that they're not going to necessarily be able to change anything within until the regime essentially collapses.
Well, every revolution is the kicking in of a rotten door.
Right.
But if we take all of the door kickers, it's going to take longer.
Yeah.
Okay.
And another point is, why should I care? They're not my people. They have their own problems. I have mine.
Okay.
It's not my place to better them. It's my place to better my own people.
Okay.
It sounds cold and callous, but that's part of the reason why we're in the trouble we're in nowadays. We keep intervening in everybody else's affairs, and look what it gets us.
Right. Well, and to a point, I do agree. And like I said, I do believe in a very very cracked down. And I'd say, my vision for the borders, you don't necessarily need a wall. You need guard towers and let the soldiers do their jobs. Let the border patrol, stick a few bullets in a few heads, and then that'll solve the problem. But
if I was going to allow, if I'm in a perfect scenario where immigration could be perfectly controlled,
okay,
I would require a college education of some kind.
Okay.
Because frankly, I don't want your cold, huddled masses.
Right.
If I'm going to let your people in at all, I want your best and brightest. I want people who will enrich my country.
Right.
Because your country isn't my concern. Okay. I don't have to foot the bill for the infrastructure of your country.
Okay.
I don't have to support the starving people of your country when they don't work.
Right.
But when people come in here and they don't have work, I have to support them.
Right.
And that is inherently, it's immoral and unjust.
Right. Right.
I would say college education of some kind, mandatory military service.
Right.
If you're not willing to fight and bleed for my country, I don't want you here.
That I actually would agree with that. That would be that to me sounds like a valid requirement if you're going to come over.
Anyone willing to fight for Skyrim is a Nord.
And that would be a precondition.
Right.
That you wouldn't get your citizenship until your term of military service was over.
Yeah. And okay, run this by you now, because you have groups that let's say you have a groups of say you're white supremacist or you're KKK or something like that essentially let's lynch all the black people because we don't like them because reasons. How do when you're talking about delegitimizing these situations, how do you do that? And also, say what?
No, nothing. Go ahead.
Okay. How do you do that and actually get in there and actually delegitimize them and actually hey, these guys are not really serious. These guys are not necessarily serious, or you guys, your idea is stupid.
Well, we have a bit of a blessing on our side in that a lot of our fringe groups are already illegitimate.
Yeah, nobody takes the National Socialist movement seriously.
Right.
Nobody.
Well, the thing
nobody
is,
takes the Klan seriously.
National Socialism is growing in America, largely because the Overton window is opening, and if there's to be right-wing reform of any form in America, the Nazis are probably going to have a hand in it.
Yeah.
However, all we really have to do to delegitimize them once their work is done is just keep them right where they're at, and once the Overton window narrows again, once again they are illegitimate.
So when you say the Overton window, would you care to enlighten those of us who don't know what that means?
Go for it, Chadis.
All right. So basically, the Overton window is the idea that there is a range of acceptable positions and ideas that can be expressed in mainstream political discourse.
Okay.
For a very long time, the window was closed, which means that there was a very, very narrow window of things that could be talked about, mostly on the progressive leftist side of politics.
Right.
So, and that's where you get a lot of your ideas of, for instance, the homosexual rights movement and all that. And this growing acceptance of pedophiles, which is insane. But things like that. The very far left neo-progressive ideas.
Yeah. It used to be that you couldn't think about discussing normalizing pedophilia in the U.S. Now here we are because the Overton window has widened to the left.
Yeah.
Whereas in the 50s, if you expressed communist sentiment, you got to say hello to Senate.
Yeah.
So the Overton window for a very long time has been widening left.
Yeah.
But here very recently, where we've started to identify the bullshit that is the left, the window has been widening right to balance it out.
Well, the necessary overreaction that I talked about last week.
Yeah,
right?
it is the necessary overreaction. That's why we can even have this conversation and not be called, seditious and all of this jazz. Because think about it, in the mid 2000s, would you have heard anyone discussing ethno-nationalism in a socially acceptable way?
No, absolutely not.
And yet here we are. The Overton window is widening in our direction.
Well, shoot, that would have been considered a fringe element just 10 years ago. So,
yeah. And we're still kind of on the fringe of what is acceptable, but now the discussion is
We're
acceptable.
within that range.
Yeah.
But the window will start closing again. Hopefully it'll start closing from the left towards us.
So run this by you. Is that because by that logic, could it be said that what's going on and what's happening is organic and will eventually balance itself out?
I don't believe there's such a thing as political balance.
Okay.
Personally, I view politics as very much like a pendulum. It started on one side or the other at some point and swings between the two.
Right.
Every now and then something will happen that will slow down that swing, and the arc will get a little bit smaller. But eventually there are major events throughout history that will tap that pendulum and swing it more in one direction or the other. For instance, the arc had started kind of slowing near the end of the 19th century, and things were kind of settling in the more traditionalist, classical right-wing sort of position.
Yeah.
And then we had the Bolshevik Revolution, and that threw open the floodgates for a lot of leftist thought.
Yeah.
And so that tapped that ball and swung it to the far left, and that's where it's been. And then we had like the all the shit that went on here in the 60s. The sexual revolution, the rise of the American New Left, things like that, that slowed that rightward arc. So it kind of got stuck on the left for the last 50 years.
Yeah.
But now we have things like the refugee crisis and the attack on white identity that is giving us a much-needed push towards the right.
Right.
Interesting.
I believe very, very strongly that history is driven by two things: great men and great events. Big events and strong men shape history.
I can agree with that. And it's, getting back to the Nat Sox and the National Socialists and the far, far, far fringe elements of the... I don't even necessarily consider them... I really don't even know if I consider them right-wing, simply because what they are pushing isn't as political as much as it is like social, and what they want is very...
Well, and the right the right since the French Revolution has always been very social. It's really with the coming of the Soviet Union and the Cold War that it really started getting economic, turned into this capitalism versus communism kind of thing.
My biggest issue with the National Socialism isn't that because Germany and the ideas that Germany had and their movement and their involvement in World War II, that doesn't scare me.
Yeah,
like Hitler is not going to come back. Is not going to come back in a puff of smoke and retake the Rhine. I'm not worried about that kind of stuff. The political movement is. The political movement exists. It was done in Germany. It was the last time it was done, but that should not color the political movement itself. If that makes any sense, you can separate the man from the movement. The idea.
Like if you actually look at the ideas of National Socialism, they're really not anything terrifying.
They're not. But my issue with National Socialism as a idea is I just don't think, A, I don't think it would work, especially in the U.S., and B, I just don't think it's what the U.S. needs, or the rest of the world for that matter. The idea that National Socialism, it simply won't solve the problems that we have.
Yeah, it worked very well in Germany before the war.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, like there isn't any one correct political ideology.
There's just what works at the time. What do we need?
Well, it's not
right
even so
now?
much works at the time, it's what worked. You have to look at... So, we have this idea that there are good and bad political ideologies, and we like to ascribe moral alignments to them and all this other fancy bullshit.
Yeah.
But it really comes down to what ideology works for your people in your part of the world at a given time.
Yeah.
For instance, there is no doubt in my mind that there is a place somewhere on this planet where good old Hitlerian National Socialism works just fucking fine. No doubt in my mind that there is a country that right now that would work for. Will they ever adopt it? Probably not, because there's a stigma against it. There's probably a country, actually, Stalinist communism would probably work very well here in the States because we have the natural resources to keep it going and we have a large enough workforce.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mesh with our culture.
And no idea is inherently evil.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's such a thing as an I don't think that, well, at least in terms of politics. Like,
Yeah.
there are some ideas that are just inherently evil.
Right, a political discourse.
There are no political ideologies that are inherently evil.
Or the wrong idea for the right reasons, or
Well, I don't even think it's so much the wrong idea for the right reasons as it is the wrong idea the right idea at the wrong time and place
For the wrong people.
well, because
Germany realistically needed National Socialism when it sprouted up because they were a dying country when it came about.
Yeah.
Getting back to the original conversation though, as to how we rein in the National Socialist crowd, we're not going to get rid of them. We just can't. They're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
However, I think and I don't really think we should embrace them and bring them in. I do, however, believe that it would be advantageous to minimize certain elements of their particular group. Like, for instance, the NSM they're fucking psychos. They're full-blown annihilationists. They want to gas all the Jews. They want to hang all the blacks. Fuck those guys.
Yeah.
Then you look at, for instance, the Traditionalist Workers' Party, who they're Strasserists. So they're a little bit more on the socialist side of National Socialism.
Mm-hmm.
They're a much more even-keeled party. Are they still a little crazy and fringe? Yeah. But if I'm going to have National Socialists kicking around in my backyard, I'd much rather have them than the NSM. So I think the idea I think one thing we can do to help kind of restrict the influence of right-wing fringe groups is to not necessarily encourage the growth of one group over another, but try to how do I word this? Try to starve out the crazier groups while pointing at the less crazy ones. Like, for instance, if you're talking to somebody about, for instance, National Socialism, lean them toward the TWP instead of the NSM.
Yeah.
Like, if somebody is expressing Nazi sentiment, try to guide them towards less noxious Nazis.
Yeah, because within any political sphere, you have degrees. Like in my case, there are some pretty crazy quote unquote fascist groups out there who say some pretty terrible shit.
Yeah.
And my party, we refuse to associate with those groups. We don't have anything to do with them because we disagree with them on those things.
Right.
Well, you run on the same thing. You run on the same thing with groups like the Hoteps versus the Black Panther Party, and that's
much rather have the Hoteps king.
It's a really interesting thing to watch because it's a mirror image of what's going on in our I don't know if you want to call it Aryan, Caucasian, the white sphere.
Yeah.
It's a mirror image of it because you have the Hoteps trying to claim identity and trying to garner some identity. And just like we have these Nazis and these like 1488ers and these crazy fringe elements, they have the Black Panthers that they have to deal with, which is literally the exact same thing in the other direction.
Yeah, they want to gas all the whites and
and when I say 1488ers, I'm gonna. So the 14 words themselves are not inherently terrible.
I have no problem with them.
The 14 words are not inherently terrible. It's simply a matter of saying we have the right to exist. That is all it's saying. The fact that Adolf Hitler was the one that coined the term is unfortunate.
He wasn't?
No.
The 14 words, I can't remember who exactly it was, but it was pre-war. It was in the either in the 80s or 90s. I want to say it was one of the white nationalist groups here in the United States. One of their heads actually created the 14 words as part of a longer.
Despite the truth of the matter, it's associated with Adolf Hitler, which is quite frankly, which is kind of unfortunate.
Yeah.
But because the words themselves have no hate to them. There's no hate in the 14 words, none. It's simply an idea that we exist, we have a right to exist, and we have a right to have children and be able to populate the earth and work alongside with other people. The 88-bit is the issue I have. The 14 words I don't really have an issue with simply because it's a pro-white statement, not an anti-anything else statement. That's where from my personal taste anyway I draw the line. I will not be anti someone else. I'm not for hate. I'm not for discrimination of any form, in any type, in any way. Mm-hmm. What I am for is promoting my culture and my people and making sure my people are safe, happy, healthy, fed.
Yeah.
And if there's some left over, I'll keep the door open. But the 88-bit, the whole, we have to take care of,
we have to kill everyone else to make sure we're
exactly.
safe.
That's insanity.
Yeah. Jackrabbit and I have actually talked extensively about this. Our fringe elements are typically fringe elements because they're adversarial.
Mm-hmm.
They want to lift up the white race as to the detriment of all others.
Right.
And that's another way we can deal with the fringe element is we can really promulgate the idea that you don't have to be against someone else to make your country great.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, you don't
have
all the Nazis are gas the Jews race war now. Well, if we have our ethno-state and they have their ethno-state and we don't really associate much, we just do everything we can to build up our ethno-state, we have cultivated a situation where it is absolutely unnecessary to gas the Jews because they're not hurting us, we're not hurting them.
I don't need to kill a single person to rebuild the Library of Alexandria.
No.
Yeah.
I don't need to kill a single person to create a massive university. I don't need to kill a single person to go to space. I don't need to kill a single person to study.
Yeah.
These. It's simply a matter of, and it's interesting because I run into this a lot with the other side, the left.
Yeah.
They're always against shit. They're not for anything, and that's the big difference.
Smash the patriarchy.
Well, it's like, when you go to some of these sites, you're like, we're against homophobia and LGBT and transphobia and Islamophobia, and we're against, and that.
But what are you for?
It sounds wonderful. Like, it sounds fantastic that you're against all those things, but you're not for shit.
Yeah.
Like, if you define yourself by what you're against, the things will never go away because they have to be there. Because if that's your only identity is being against those things, if those things stop existing, you don't have an identity.
Well, and you can never get these people to tell you what they want to replace all this shit with.
Right.
Everything exists to fill a place. There is a place for everything.
And that's like, I can't stop harping on the Aryan Brotherhood because they're just so stupid.
Yeah.
If you go to one of their rallies, it's a bunch of tatted up skinheads jumping around in a mosh pit saying, white power, white power, white power. What are you going to do to bring about white power? We'll kill everybody else.
Okay.
How does that make us powerful? You don't build yourself up by tearing others down.
It's actually impossible to do that. It makes you look like a weak bully.
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of like the whole idea between the National Socialist Movement and the Traditionalist Workers' Party. The Traditionalist Workers' Party says right there in their manifesto they support all separatist movements.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't want to be part of their new social order, they will help you break away and form a new state.
Yeah.
The Traditionalist Workers' Party actually cooperates with the new Black Panther Party to hold their rallies in the same cities at the same time so that they can bounce listeners for their ideas back and forth between the two rallies.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they have their ethno-state and we have our ethno-state, we're not in conflict.
Right.
And I think this is a good portion of how we should go about delegitimizing our own fringe elements. We need to impress on people that you need to be for us, not against the world.
Yeah.
Another thing we can do is something that's a little bit more practical. If you find out, for instance, that there's going to be one of these fringe groups, get your friends together, do a counter rally or a counter protest.
Yeah.
Actively take a stand against them. And that's something you don't see the left do.
Yeah.
That's true.
How often do you see leftists protesting Antifa?
Never.
You never will.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's because the left is run by a bunch of insane individuals.
Well, and they all
new
fundamentally agree on the same thing.
Right. That's kind of and that's kind of through, and that's kind of what we're saying is, in a way, you look after your own tribe and your own group first, and if you have a little bit of extra wheat, you can help the other neighboring tribe if they're in a state of famine.
If there's leftover mammoth meat, we'll have a barbecue.
Right, we'll invite the Indians over for Thanksgiving,
Yeah. As long as they can pay the admission fee. I don't believe in giving away things for free.
And we shouldn't give them smallpox when we're done.
Yeah.
we should definitely, like, if an American ethno-state were made, we should definitely continue trading with other countries.
This is an interpersonal thing, not a statecraftian thing.
Yeah. Well, and when it comes to a statecraft, even if you say, let's say the other state is in a state of famine, and we have surplus food, we send stuff over. Oh, guess what? We have a new friend now. Granted, you give wisely. You don't give to North Korea, but you know what I'm saying. You try to. You can establish goodwill or you can try to work in trade agreements with those countries.
Yeah. Hey, we have all this extra food. We have no problem giving it to you. It'd be kind of cool if we could trade with you exclusively for iPods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the one thing that kind of sketches me about that is, like, if you let that go on unchecked, that's how you get globalism.
Well, the problem and that's simply statecraft. That's it may be something you don't like, but it's something that has to be controlled, and that's where the traditional movement comes in, the traditionalist movement, because that will keep that in check, in theory, anyway.
Yeah, right. Well, and the thing is, there is a fine line between global trade and globalism. You can trade with whoever you want for whatever you want.
Yeah.
Where it goes from being global trade to globalism is when you start letting those people come in and replace your workers.
Yeah,
it's when you start feeding them and maintaining their infrastructure at the expense of your own people.
Right.
And that's always look after what's within your borders first.
Right. If every man is my brother, no man is my brother.
Yeah,
right. And that's one of the things you run into with, say, the United States. We used to be the biggest creditor nation in the world, and now we are the biggest debtor nation in the world. And that's kind of what Chadis was bringing up. It went on unchecked, and I really and truly, I do believe the pendulum has got to swing back in the other direction in a big way. I do believe in a state of isolationism to a point. Now, granted, I don't know if that's entirely plausible in a modern sense, just especially considering how intertwined the United States is with other nation states.
I think we're actually one of the few countries that can get away with it, given our wealth of natural resources.
Yeah.
Everything we need, we have.
Yeah.
We're one of the now, the rest of the world would starve, but not my people.
Yeah. Well, and that's, that was actually George Washington had himself warned against getting too far entangled in other nations' affairs. And I think that's something we need to look at and kind of study at and say, have we gone too much in the other direction? I think we have gone so far away from what the original founding fathers wanted us to be and wanted us to become. Because essentially, when you read in their papers, they wanted us to become an empire, much like Rome was, but Rome was also self-sufficient. We are not anymore. We are getting oil from 5 or 6, from Saudi Arabia, and
Yeah. Here we are.
Yep.
So the basics of removing these fringe elements, or like delegitimizing them, or whatever words you want to use. So it would be push people away as far as you can from those fringe elements if they're of a type.
Yeah, or essentially try to convert them over.
Yeah, and if you can't, you at least try to do damage control. And a lot of times, especially in the right, we have a tool that a lot of people on the left don't.
Logic.
Well, yeah.
To a point.
Yeah, I'm not trying to be a dick.
Yeah.
Because that's, and I'm really not. I'm not trying to be a dick about it. What I'm saying is that most leftists don't really respond. Most leftists don't really respond extraordinarily well to logical reasoning. They tend to be more emotion based. People on the right tend to be more logically based and less emotionally based. We have a lot of Spocks in the right wing, which is why these ideas are allowed and can be discussed, because when you have a lot of Spocks in a room, it stops being what about the kids and it starts being what's the best possible outcome for everybody.
Yeah.
But so you have a lot of that. So in a lot of these scenarios, you can talk to these people that are starting to have like these ideas, and you say, okay, here's why that isn't going to work.
Yeah.
And we have that ability in the right. And if they fly off the handle, they're really no different than leftists, and there's no reaching them anyway.
Right. Also, I think you're talking about a logical and a well thought out point of view versus a, case in point. I think CNN had a panel on, or they had something, or they had a little girl from Syria that came on, and they were going on like, oh, why should we get involved in Syria? And the entire logic was, this little girl is sad, so we should go bomb Syria.
This little girl is sad, let's bomb Syria. No, I think I remember that.
Well, it started because she supposedly had a bunch of very, very heart-wrenching tweets.
Yeah.
And you look at them, and they're very well written. They're grammatically perfect English.
Yeah.
We're talking like, late high school, early college level writing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's reel this in real quick. What was the point you were trying to get at?
Anyway, so, as soon as someone uses a think about the children argument, immediately I just shut off. Because, and on the same thing on the far fringe right, as soon as they start bringing up, the gas the Jews and, I hate black people, immediately my brain just shuts off because you have nothing to bring to the table.
I won't be needing this today.
Well, and we look at these fringe elements that we're talking about, like, we've named them 100 times. I don't need to do it again. But their argument is, think about the white children.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's a terrible argument.
And the idea, and I've looked into a lot of this about and I've done a lot of thought, and this is going to go into one of the pieces I'm getting ready to write, because it's been entirely too long since I've contributed to the webpage.
Same.
Yeah, I know, I really have been.
Do you want to write for us?
Yeah, write for us. Coffee pot, write for us.
I'm not sure if I can...
Write for us, coffee pot.
Okay, do it.
I can't help but notice that there's no pressure coming in my direction.
Nobody likes you.
No, but one of the articles I'm getting ready to write is...
I'm just kidding, Covert. Jesus loves you.
No, he doesn't.
One of the articles I'm getting ready to write on the website is a discussion between... it's going to be a discussion on race, specifically as it involves interracial relationships and things like that. Yeah, and the idea is like people, you say that when that's a fucking dirty word on the right, and I don't understand why. People lose their damn minds if they see two people of different races dating.
In certain groups in the right, I think it's more open than it was, say, back in the 60s.
Agreed, but I'm talking about specifically in this sphere of politics.
Right,
and the issue there is, the issue that people need to realize, and I wish that I could, beat this into people's heads, it's not, if you allow people to do whatever the fuck they want, usually speaking, people tend to date and marry and have kids with people that look like them. That's just how life works.
It's actually interracial relationships will never be the majority. Humans simply aren't wired that way.
All right, but my issue with it is, shut the fuck up. Yeah. Let them date who makes them happy. Let them be people and let them be happy people together.
Right. Yeah.
This is not a save our race issue.
Yeah. Right.
The issue with that is the pushing from the globalists. The issue is the idea that you're making it a more moral choice to date someone outside of your race, or that it's a more moral decision to say, no, I don't want to date you because you happen to be of the same ethnicity as me.
I've actually seen posters put up by various Antifa groups stating that if you see a white person involved with another white person, you need to physically stop them.
That's what I'm getting at.
That's fucking insane.
So my argument, and it will be in this article I'm writing, is leave people the fuck alone. And you know what? I know I'm going to get called alt-light by one of the 3 people that actually pays attention to the website we have. Right. But if we end up getting more popular, I know I'm going to get called alt-light for this, and I don't fucking care. If that makes me alt-light, so be it.
At this point, I've disavowed the term. I've disavowed the alt-right, as it were, because they've started the purity spiral. Like at this point, the loose amalgamation that is the alt-right is just as cancerous as Antifa or any other group.
Yeah.
Well,
let's be honest.
I do not agree with, but I can understand the concern about mixed race relationships. Okay. I don't see a problem with it. Let me get that.
Yeah, because that was a little backwards. It made it sound like you.
No, I do not agree with objecting to
okay.
mixed race relationships. However, I can understand why some people might object. Because if you're an ethno-nationalist, you're trying to create an ethno-state, when you mix ethnicities, it makes things messy. No, you don't want to have to, they might not want to have to answer the question, well, but what about mixed race people?
Well, that's their failing, not ours.
Yeah.
That's their inability to.
Not only that, I've also found that most that I have met, and I've not met many, but most people that end up in a mixed racial relationship, both parties and both groups actually share a common ideology of some sort. So I don't know that it would be an issue per se. Granted, in some groups I can see from an ethno-nationalist standpoint, but you think about it, 3 or 4 generations into it, they're going to be predominantly one ethnicity.
Like we were talking about earlier, ethnic identity is exactly that, an identity.
The blood calls.
A white woman and a black man can have a mixed race child, and be perfectly fine within a white ethno-state, so long as the culture is such that that mixed race child grows up and integrates into our culture. Yeah. The problem we've seen is that mixed race children are almost always considered black.
Yeah. We kind of shoehorn them into an identity.
And that's an issue I have.
We need to stop doing that.
We really do. Yeah. And we need to stop pretending like we know what the fuck's going on there, because a lot of times we don't.
Yeah.
Because that individual, as that child grows up, will either in completely or in action decide what he or she wants to do and how they want to conduct themselves and live their life.
And most commonly, they'll follow their father's footsteps.
Yeah, exactly. However the family is running at the time is generally the direction they'll go, but not always. And that's on them, is what I'm getting at. Yeah, if they let's say an Asian person, and let's take white people completely out of the equation. Let's say an Asian woman and a black man get married and they have a baby.
Okay.
That baby grows up. It will, at some point, most likely unknowingly, because these kind of conversations don't happen in normal spheres of thought. That child will unknowingly, one way or the other, start acting a certain way. Either he or she is going to act more Asian, or he or she is going to act more black. Neither way is right or wrong.
Yeah. And when we say acting Asian or acting black, we mean conforming to that culture.
Yeah, exactly. Culture. They're going to start responding in that cultural way.
Yeah.
Neither one is right or wrong. I'm trying to be very clear about this. I'm not putting a moral judgment on either way, but they will start behaving in a way of one culture or the other, and that is the way they will lean.
Right.
And that is fine.
Right.
And if these people can't accept that, shame on them.
Yeah.
And in the context of an ethno-state, I'm sorry, I keep ethno-stating. But within that context, if we foster a culture of integration into the majority culture, if we, we had this discussion about, what do we do with America? Yeah. If we made an American ethno-state, if our black minorities started going to college, contributing to the workforce, not stealing people's bikes, I'm sorry, then we wouldn't have an issue with them, and they could be integrated into the culture completely.
And to clarify, he is speaking of the small minority of African Americans who actually do that.
Yeah. Well, shoot. One of my past bosses that I had, actually the grocery store I was looking at, my manager was a black man. I have the utmost respect for that man. Utmost respect for him, because he's clean cut. He made something of himself, and he works his butt off.
Oh,
he
yeah.
Contributes. That is one of the guys that I have no problem with him finding a nice white woman and making a whole bunch of babies. I got no problem with him.
Yeah. All of my best NCOs while I were in the Army, all of my favorite sergeants were all black.
Right.
Because their specific subculture is very well suited to that kind of activity.
Right.
And I respect them greatly because they bring something valuable to Army culture in that specific context. And because they also integrate into that culture.
Right.
If we could do that on a national level, it would be great.
Yeah, that this has been a good conversation, I think.
I think so too.
So I think we can basically sum this up with, we don't really give a shit what color you are, as long as you act like a reasonable human being.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's really what it kind of boils down to.
Yeah.
And if you have different ideas of how your people group should be treated, or if you have different ideas on how your people group should function, go do it.
Yeah.
Within, if you can, and if not, start putting work like the HOTEP, start working towards a way that you could.
Start opening up a dialogue.
Yeah.
Don't crash into, don't break the windows at the Starbucks and.
Yeah, exactly. Start a conversation, because
Yeah.
there's more people willing to listen than you would think.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think we can all admit that there are shitheads in every color.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, this has been RightCast Radio. I am your host. They call me the Jackrabbit. With me, as always, is the founder of RightChan
Chadis.
and our two commentators.
Coffee pot.
And Cobra.
Guys, we hope you enjoyed this week. Tune in next week, and we'll have some new content for you. Take care.